Here we are again. This is the second session of our survey of the Old Testament. We're flying low through a whole bunch of material in the Old Testament. Last week we got as far as the first introduction. I showed you a bunch of pictures of landscape, bits and pieces all over the ancient world around Israel. Israel is a very small place and yet a very complex place with a lot of interesting details. It's fun to just go hike around. It's fun to visit. But for Christians, the land of Israel is like a fifth gospel. There are so many details on the ground that are great illustrations of what is happening in the biblical text itself. The Bible is not a made-up story. The Bible is history. It is the record of the interaction over the centuries of God's people with a living God in a real place at real times. The events that are mentioned really happened. And it is possible to track these things. We can research this just as far as we like. I challenge my students to disprove my points. when I teach them things about the Old Testament, I say, prove that this didn't happen. Go ahead, do what you like. All of their questions can be answered. And this land of Israel is just part of that. We're going to continue the introduction today. We may even get as far as the beginning of Genesis, but I'm not counting on that, so I didn't send out notes. But I'm hoping today we can finish up the introduction, and I may just show you a video to get us in the right mindset for jumping into Genesis. Genesis is one of my favorite books in the whole Bible. As I have gotten older, I have realized that it is more important than I had originally thought. So we will spend some time with Genesis. If you were in on the meeting in Cosenza last August, I should tell you that this lecture will be expanded quite a lot from what you experienced there. We were really hurrying there. And now it doesn't feel like we need to move quite so quickly. So we'll take some time and do it as well as possible. Okay, I am going to share a screen. See if I can make this all work. Yes, share, oops, there. And then it's going to want me to do the presenter view. Okay. Let's start out by saying a few words about the topic is the literature of the Old Testament. And when we look at this stuff, I'll point to a couple of things that are going on here. Let's see if I can use a spotlight or pink. Oops, that didn't work. Oh, I hate it when that happens. There we go. I have here a cute little annotation button thing that that allows me to supposedly point out stuff on the screen, but that doesn't work. The language of the Old Testament is Hebrew. We've mentioned that before. On the left side of this screen, you see a clay tablet. That thing is really, really old. That dates to about 1,000 years before Christ. It's in the Hebrew language, but it's written in the archaic script, what we call the angular script of Hebrew. It dates way back. One of the really interesting fields of study has to do with the origins of alphabets, and the language of the Old Testament is one of the first languages in the whole world to have an alphabet. It seems to have developed at about the time that Egypt, or that Israel was in Egypt during the Egyptian sojourn. So sometime after after Joseph invited Jacob down to Egypt, and during those 430 years that Israel was in Egypt, they committed their language to an alphabet. The alphabet is somewhat dependent on Egyptian hieroglyphics and somewhat dependent on some other forms. But what really makes Hebrew unique in the ancient world is the fact that it's written with an alphabet, not with pictures, not with syllables, but with individual letters, just like English or Italian or Tagalog. In our modern world, we're used to writing everything with an alphabet. If you have Chinese friends, you know that their ancient script is pictograms, uh, hundreds of individual little pictures that form words. And in the ancient world, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians both came up with picture languages, and they were able to make that work. Uh, in order to make it work, you had to literally memorize, hundreds and hundreds of individual pictures and what they meant. The alphabet only has 23 letters. And in addition to that, there are vowels that everybody just knew, that we've since the scribes have added vowels to the text. But there's that very, very ancient Hebrew to the left from a place called Gezer. On the right is a scroll from among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 1948 near a place called Qumran in Israel, right on the eve of Israel's independence. This particular one, I believe this is part of the Psalms. I can't read it from here. It's kind of fun for those of us who read Hebrew to go back to Israel and go to a place called the Shrine of the Book, because there they have some copies of fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they're under glass and very well preserved, and it's actually possible to go up and read them. Those of us who read Hebrew can read the Dead Sea Scrolls, 2,500-year-old manuscripts. Quite fun and very, very interesting. Okay, so what do we find in the Old Testament? When we begin reading the Old Testament, one of the first things that we find is history. The narrative of Israel's life. Now, there is always a theological intention. The history of Israel is written by the prophets and sometimes by the priests, and so they always include God in the story. I think it's probably fair to call the Old Testament holy history. I think so. But when we say that it is holy history, we should not forget that it is, in fact, history. And history in the scientific sense, the modern sense of the term. When we write history today, we try to go back to what are called primary sources. things that were written by people who were there, artifacts from that particular time, uh, 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 photographs, geography, all these sorts of things that allow us in a scientific sense, in a critical sense, to look at what really happened and then write the narrative of it. We believe that the authors of the Old Testament history were either eyewitnesses or worked from the writings of eyewitnesses to the events of the Old Testament. So Moses was not present for the creation, of course. He wasn't present when Joseph went down into Egypt. But Adam was present at the creation. And Joseph was present when Jacob came down into Egypt. And it's not unreasonable to think that those people kept some kind of records. Now, we don't have any of those records. We have hints of those records, particularly in the book of Genesis. By the time Exodus picks up, Moses himself is the main character. Moses claims to have written these books. Moses was there, so what we have in the first 5 books of Moses is a first-person eyewitness account of history. Those of us who do history are convinced that eyewitness accounts are the very best kind of history. So for a while, years ago, I was very interested in the battles of World War II. I was planning to take my 2 sons to Europe to visit some of the historical sites. And I got into uh, some very, very good books. There's a book about D-Day by Stephen Ambrose that is a collection of his interviews with men and some women who were actually there. On the boats, on the beach, in the pillboxes, shooting back, in the hospitals, uh, people who were actually there and could tell their stories. The people who were there didn't all see everything, but when you put all of the stories together, it forms a remarkable, vibrant picture, a story of what really happened. The Old Testament is like that. It rings true as the story of eyewitnesses to the events themselves. The form of the literature is historical narrative. And one of the ways that we can tell that, I'm not sure what Tagalog does, and for that matter, I should really check sometime how the Italian Bible does this. But in some of our older versions of English, Old Testament history has a habit of starting sentences with and it came to pass that such and such and such and such. And today we don't do that because translators know that the and at the beginning of a sentence is wrong grammatically. We're not supposed to do that anymore. But we also know that the and at the beginning of a sentence is a Hebrew form that says, this is a sequence of events. That's one of the tags in the literature that says this is history. This is intended as an honest, critical, objective record of what really happened. I emphasize that because so often we Christians and the Jewish people before us are criticized for holding to mythology. We believe the Bible out of faith, not because there is any truth to it. And that's wrong. We believe the Bible primarily because of its close connection to verifiable history. These things really happened, primarily for us as Christians, this is most important, and actually for Jews, this should be important as well. The resurrection happened. Messiah, predicted by the Old Testament, came and walked among us, died for sins, and was resurrected on the third day. The resurrection happened in space and time of history. And that historical event where God walked into history and performed the greatest of all possible miracles is the basis of all of the rest of it. And so the rest of history we know has to be true. So history. As we get farther along, I'll show you how the dates work out. We can actually assign dates for biblical events back to about 3,000 years before Christ, give or take quite a bit by the time we get there. Abraham is actually about 2,200 years before Christ, 2166 to be exact, but who's counting? So 2,000 years before Christ, and from there on we have very good numbers for virtually everything that happens in the Old Testament. I use the dates because they're real. These things really happened at a time and place, and it matters when things happen. These are not merely flannel graph stories, they really happen. Secondly, God provided poetry, a second kind of literature in the Old Testament we call poetry. Poetry is the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, and the Book of Job. Plus, we find poetry in a variety of other places. The difference between history and poetry is fairly obvious for anybody who's reading it. You know, I don't have to define the terms. Poetry communicates with images and word pictures, similes and figures of speech, often an emotional component. It can be fun to read. Poetry communicates with a kind of word parallel that I'll explain better as we get farther along. Well, one of the primary ways that you can tell the difference between poetry and history is in the form of the words themselves, particularly the punctuation of the lines. People often don't know that. The first time you read the Hebrew Bible, you go to a lot of trouble to memorize the funny squiggles that are around the letters of the alphabet. Some of those are vowels, and some of them are a kind of punctuation that we call pointing. Those points are not obvious. Some of them are accents. And there is a different collection of about 20 accents for history than there is for poetry. And anybody who's reading a piece of Hebrew for the very first time will check the accents rapidly to make sure he reads it right. Because you read poetry differently than you read history. So it's possible to tell the difference. Our modern Bibles should all print books like the Psalms and a lot of the prophets like Isaiah in poetic verse form, because that's the form that it was in the original Hebrew. A third kind of literature we call wisdom literature. Wisdom literature is often poetic, but it's a different form. The wisdom literature, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Song of Solomon, and Job, in addition to being poetry, are also designed to teach common sense. The wise man, or sometimes he's called the sage, was the teacher who would show up around the campfire and teach the group wisdom. The sage is like visualize Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings, and you've got a pretty good picture of the guy. The wise man collected wisdom in very practical ways from all over the ancient world. So the Proverbs are not uniquely Israel's. We find Proverbs in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Hittite lands, and these Proverbs often are closely related to the Hebrew Proverbs. Beyond wisdom literature is a class of literature we call prophecy. The prophets are unique in Israel. The prophets were God's spokesman who called the people to repentance by predicting doom if Israel continued in sin, or blessing if she returned to the Lord. The doom or the curse and the blessing, on the other hand, are two of the most important concepts in the Old Testament. And we see that doom and blessing continuing all the way through the Bible into the New Testament, all the way to the book of Revelation. So it's a fairly important concept that will develop later. The prophets spoke to their own era and to all of us about the future of the world. For in the process of calling the people of Israel to repentance, the prophets routinely revealed God's purposes for Israel, the surrounding nations, and for the world. It is the prophets primarily who give us good information about what to look for in the life of the Messiah. How should Israel recognize her Messiah when he comes? Oh, there will be this, and there will be this, and there will be this, and there will be this. And there are several hundred very specific, very unique prophecies about what Messiah would do, who he would be, how he would be born, where he would be born, all of the details of the life of Christ are predicted in the prophets. And those things were fulfilled. For instance, his birth in Bethlehem was literally fulfilled. His entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday on a donkey was literally fulfilled. And the prophets have lots and lots of other things to say. Something that we really have to understand about the Old Testament prophets is that when they predicted a future event, they intended for us to understand that as a literal thing. So the birth of Christ in Bethlehem did not mean that Christ could just as easily be born in Cairo or in Paris or in Philadelphia. It meant Bethlehem, and Bethlehem has a specific meaning in space and time history. So that's what we expect. I make a point of that because many modern Bible interpreters believe that the prophets of the Old Testament were being literal when they were speaking of the first coming of Christ, but are being quite allegorical when they speak of the events surrounding the second coming of Christ. I'm one of those crazy people who believe that the prophets were always giving us God's word, and God's word can always be trusted. And therefore, the prophecies concerning the first coming and the prophecies concerning the second coming are all to be understood literally. That means there is history that has yet to be experienced that was written by the prophets. So as we work through the Old Testament, we'll hear about the kingdom age, the kingdom program. I'll speak about the second coming of the Messiah. I'll speak about the day of the Lord, the great tribulation period, the millennial kingdom. All of these things are literally predicted by the Old Testament prophets. And if we're to understand the first coming of Christ, literally, we ought to expect to understand the second coming of Christ, literally. That's only consistent. There's a fifth kind of Old Testament literature that we call apocalyptic, and we'll recognize it when we get to it. Daniel and Ezekiel put a big emphasis on imagery and symbols. So with Daniel, you get a giant statue, and then you get four beasts, and you get birds coming down and picking things out of a tree, and it's lots of pictures. Ezekiel has wheels within wheels, and he has a chariot coming out of a big cloud. Apocalyptic literature is not unique to the Old Testament. The book of Revelation is also apocalyptic. It is just as true as the more pedestrian prophets, but we have to understand the use of imagery and symbol. So the chariot coming out of the cloud is supposed to give us some truth about the throne of God. We shouldn't make it get down and run on all fours, as we say. We shouldn't try to make every part of the chariot into a separate part of the throne of God. I doubt that God actually tries to work from a chariot day by day. Anyway, that's apocalyptic literature. We'll get into that. I need to say a little bit about the language of the Old Testament, a little bit about Hebrew. We've mentioned quite a bit about this, but I'll say just a bit more. The Old Testament was written mostly in Hebrew, which is one of the Semitic languages. Later on, I'll introduce Noah. Noah had three sons who are Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Shem is the source of the Shemitic languages, Semitic. That is the languages belonging to the Middle East. So other languages like it are Arabic, which is the major Semitic language today. There's also Aramaic, which became Syriac, and minor languages of Canaan like Ugaritic and others. Ethiopic is a Semitic language, and there's some there's a collection of about 20 languages that fit there. So Hebrew was one of the Semitic languages. We call it Northwest Semitic because it's in the northwest corner of the Semitic area. Northeast Semitic were the languages of Mesopotamia, and there we're going to find languages written in cuneiform, wedge-shaped writing, Akkadian and Assyrian after it. In the south, particularly southwest, we have Arabic and Ethiopic and Syriac. Hebrew has an alphabet of 23 letters. It's written, strangely enough, from right to left. In English and Italian and Tagalog, we write from left to right, and we think that's normal. The Hebrews wrote from right to left. They also occasionally wrote from top to bottom, which makes for a difficult inscription to read. Sometimes they even wrote both directions. If they were writing on a great big rock, they might write all the way around the rock in whatever direction happened to satisfy them. By the time Hebrew was being used for the Bible, they were writing from right to left with 23 letters, usually on leather or papyrus. Okay, Hebrew grammar is quite different from English and other Western languages. That means it's difficult to translate. It's not impossible to translate, but we should be patient with our translators. If you have a Bible that you like to read, and I hope you do, it's not always going to be perfect, whether it's in English or Tagalog or Italian or Latin or whatever you like to read. None of our translations, particularly of the Old Testament, are perfect. Every one of them is a compromise because Hebrew thinks differently than Western languages. There are a lot of things that are just unusual about a Semitic language when compared to a Western language. So we need to be aware of that. We don't have to remember a whole lot of it, but we do need to be aware of it. Okay, what am I talking about here? Textual transmission, a little bit. How did we get the text of the Old Testament? This that you see on your screen is part of the Masoretic text I've mentioned once before, the Ben Asher Codex of the Leningrad Library. Ben Asher was a scribe from the 7th century, and this is a manuscript that's a part of the Ben Asher school of the scribes. The initial provision of the text of the Old Testament could come in a variety of ways. Sometimes there was direct revelation, like a dream or a vision. Sometimes a theophany, an appearance of God. Sometimes the angel of the Lord would simply appear and bring a message. Okay, that's a direct revelation. When a dream or a vision or a message by means of an angel came to the prophets, they simply wrote that down because that's what God gave them. Sometimes there were written records. I've already mentioned Genesis. Moses probably compiled written records in order to produce Genesis. The books of Kings and Chronicles also were written down by eyewitnesses and were put together by the writers of those books. And so the Kings were probably written by a prophet. I like to think that was Jeremiah, but I could be wrong. The Chronicles were probably written by a priest, maybe a group of priests. And the priests and the prophets had a little different perspective, so the stories come out a little bit differently, but they're all true. Some of the Old Testament seems to have begun as an oral tradition. We think parts of Jeremiah were rapidly memorized by the secretary Baruch, who wrote it down afterwards. Once the text of the Old Testament was originally produced, the books were put into something resembling their final form by a process of editing. We think the initial authors probably did most of this, but there is evidence of a process of editing in most of the books of the Old Testament. So, for instance, in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a note in the last chapter about the death of Moses and what happens immediately afterwards. Clearly, Moses didn't write that. That was written by the editor who put the book into its final form. And we conservatives believe that the editing process is included in the process of inspiration. This is all one thing, all the movement of God in the prophets and in the schools of the prophets that produced the books. So some editing usually took place. In some places of the Old Testament, we can see layers of the text. Some very early, for instance, Genesis shows evidence that there used to be a slightly different form of Hebrew, case endings and things like that, that we really don't need to worry about too much today, but the technical people We'll say, look, there are several different layers to Genesis. As the Hebrew language was updated and editors went through and brought it up to date. And that's definitely true. From about the time of the Babylonian captivity, around 600 years before Christ, the books of the Old Testament began to be copied as the major textual project. That's what they were doing. The text of the Old Testament was preserved and copied by scribes. I believe the first of the scribes were the disciples of Ezra. Not everybody believes that, but because we know there were some scribes before that. But Ezra the scribe laid down some rules for how the Bible ought to be copied, so that the resulting manuscripts would be as perfect as possible. We call these men Masoretes. I gave you a bit of an introduction to that the other day, but this text that you see on the left side of the screen, well, I guess you've got the whole screen here. The big black letters that look like they're written with calligraphy are the consonants of Hebrew. Lines and dots and squiggles are either vowels or accents. Every once in a while, you'll see a little circle. About halfway through the second line from the top, you'll see a little circle. That little circle means that we should look to the right-hand side of the page to find the footnote that tells us about that. And the squiggle on the right-hand side for that second line is an Aramaic lamed. Lamed is the letter L, and it's actually an Aramaic abbreviation. And what it's telling us is that the word on the page with the circle occurs only there in the entire book that we're looking at, which is the sort of note that happens fairly frequently. As you can see, there are lots of lameds on this page. And every time you see a lamed, you know that there is a word that only occurs in exactly this form this one time in the whole book. That way, another scribe looking at the same manuscript, when he comes at this unusual form, won't say to himself, oh, I'll bet this is a mistake. Instead, he'll say, ah, the previous scribe also noticed this and wrote down that this is the only time it occurs this way. So we're all right. We can leave this one the way it is. That's actually a very helpful thing. The notes along the side of the text form a fence around the law. The scribes made notes about how many words in the book, how many letters in the book, where's the middle letter, where's the middle word. They have a series of numbers at the beginning of every book and then again at the end of every book to check those numbers. Just to make sure that the same number of letters, the same number of words, the number of words until you get to the middle word are exactly the same at the beginning and at the end. Because if there's any error, it will show up in that checkout system. In modern computer science, we call that the checksum. If you ever send a text message, it's supposed to be 256 characters, and there's a reason for that number. 256 characters plus 8 bits for a checksum gives you exactly the right number that fit into the rubric for a text message. It's exactly right. And when a text message is sent, that number is sent at the beginning, and then at the end, the math is done on the text message, and another number is printed out. If the two of them are identical, the message continues to be sent. If the two numbers are not the same, the message is deleted and sent again. and this is done in microseconds, so you don't notice it. The ancient scribes were doing exactly the same thing. And surprisingly enough, the Old Testament is remarkably uh, well preserved. There are very, very few textual problems in the Old Testament. People think that with copy after copy after copy after copy, somebody must have made lots and lots of mistakes and everybody has messed it up and we'll never get to the bottom of it. The fact is that when we compare the manuscripts of the Old Testament, we find they are very consistent and very clean and very precisely accurate. The biblical scribes took exceptional care of our Old Testament, and we can be glad for that. It's nice that we have that foundation. Now, translation began happening even during the Old Testament period. When the Jews came back from captivity, some of them went on into the broader Greco-Roman world, and one of their favorite places to live was the big city of Alexandria in Egypt. And in Alexandria, they learned to speak Greek. Within about 2 or 3 generations, they had virtually forgotten how to speak or even how to read Hebrew. The scholars, of course, could still read Hebrew. And so an Egyptian king named Ptolemy commanded the Jews to get some scholars together and make a translation. And the tradition has it that 70 scholars got together and produced what is called the Septuagint. Septuaginta in Latin means 70. So we call it the Septuagint or LXX, which is the Roman numeral 70. It's likely that it wasn't all produced at one time. It probably was produced in several different versions. Septuagint is fascinating because it gives us insight into the text of the Old Testament 300 years before Christ. So it's actually very, very helpful for us. The differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text of the Bible are very small, but even so, some of them are really, really important. Once in a while, I'll mention those things. About 300 years after the time of Christ, we have another very important translation made into Latin. This was done by a very famous monk named Jerome, who lived in a monastery in Bethlehem. And he produced the Latin Vulgate about 300 AD. That became the standard Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. And if you have Roman Catholic friends, you'll know that they have access to or enjoy using the Vulgate. Up until 1963, modern translations were not allowed for even scholars to use. In English, the authoritative translation was done in 1611 into Elizabethan English. We call that the King James Version. And that became one of the most widely published English Bibles in the whole history of the world. And even today, many people around the world still use the King James Version because it was a very good translation into English. The Bible has been translated since that time into many, many languages. It's all over the world. It's in virtually every major language and an awful lot of minor languages, smaller languages. In English, there are lots of translations to choose from. My wife uses the NIV. I use the NASB or the ESV. And those are all good English translations. I believe that whatever Bible you find helpful is the best Bible. If the Bible that you won't read is a bad Bible, I don't care which one it is. Uh, so I believe in reading your Bible, and I believe in reading the Bible that you will actually go read. And if that's Italian or Tagalog or English, it doesn't really matter. There's an old principle, and I think it's very important, and that is that the Word of God is very hard to hide. The Word of God is very hard to hide. Translators, even translators who intend to make the Bible difficult or opaque or obscure, can't hide the Word of God. And God's truth comes through because the translators aren't smart enough to hide it all. It's there, and God is intending to speak to us and ultimately through us. Okay, that takes me to another topic. We're going to talk about dates and archaeology and some of the other stuff that is related to that. Archaeology is a popular thing. This photograph was taken in the British Library in London, and I'm looking at some faces there. I see a couple of kids who were at the Saints Bible Institute in San Lorenzo near Pordenone. Those of you in Italy know about Pordenone, about Saints Bible Institute. Brother Sam and I started that thing 20 years ago. My goodness, it's been a long time. And American Bible students came to Italy, and I remember one of those weeks. We took a group of kids on a Ryanair flight to London, stayed in a youth hostel, and visited the British Museum. It was great fun. The British Museum is full of archaeology. These are Egyptian artifacts in that museum, but there's all kinds of stuff. Archaeology is a word that's made up of two parts. The logos on the end means a study. Archaeos means old stuff. So archaeology means the study of old stuff. Okay. It's a study of ancient things or antiquity by the discovery of the material remains of the past. Archaeology uses a variety of scientific methods to uncover ancient materials. Digging is what we usually associate with archaeology. I'll show you a picture here in a little bit. But there's a lot of modern stuff that archaeology does. The archaeologist with his shovel, digging through the dirt, uncovers a past that is still there. There are some limitations to archaeology. Even well done biblical archaeology has limitations. It is not an exact science. So you see this statue head on the right in this picture. That statue head is all that we found of that statue. The rest of the statue is missing. Perhaps it was cut up into little pieces and somebody used it for countertops. We don't know what happened to the rest of that statue. It's lost in the sand somewhere. You'll notice that there's no name on that statue. We literally don't know who that's a statue of. It's some Egyptian pharaoh. The scholar who found it thought he knew, but that's his guess. And so he may think this is Akhenaten or some Egyptian pharaoh. The fact is we don't know. We're taking a guess. So that's all we have. The conclusions of archaeologists are subject to change. So we keep digging, and then we come up with a new hypothesis to explain what we've dug up. I did my doctoral work in archaeology, so I've spent a lot of time reading these things. And one of the most interesting phenomena in archaeology is the back and forth conversation among archaeologists, histories, biblical theologians, as we interact over this material. It's usually fairly friendly. Sometimes it gets to be arguments, but it's usually fairly friendly. And what we're all trying to do is come to an understanding of what really happened in the past. And I'm different from the secular archaeologists in that I believe that the Bible has a very important part to play in our understanding of the ancient world. I believe we should start with the Bible and then go looking at the archaeology for illustration. So let's just remember with that statue head just triggers this whole thing. A very small percentage of the ancient world has survived in any form. The rest of that statue is most likely gone forever. We'll never find it because it doesn't exist anymore. Very small percentages survive. Even less of the ancient world has been excavated. There are thousands of sites all over the ancient world, and we can expand this into the Mediterranean world, that have never been found, let alone properly excavated. A proper excavation is very expensive, takes a long time, and only the most important places that we've actually found have been excavated. Every couple of years, archaeologists find another place that would be very interesting if we could afford to go and excavate. Uh, and after an excavation, it takes years and years, sometimes decades, for the, the official records to be published, so that those of us out in the pews who are waiting for more illustrations from the past often have to wait 25 or 50 years before excavated things are published. And then it's published in places where it's difficult for most people to get them. Archaeology is very important, but it has so many limitations. We should never count on archaeology to give us the whole story. We should never trust the archaeologists to tell us the honest, objective, total truth. We really actually need the written records, and primarily the Bible, which is the most important written record of antiquity. With the Bible, the archaeology comes to life, and we see this character on the right as a picture of one of the pharaohs, perhaps, who oppressed Israel. Look at the pride in his face. A fellow by the name of Byron wrote a poem called Ozymandias. I am Ozymandias the Great. Look on all my works, ye world. Look upon me and fear. And there's nothing left of Ozymandias but his name and his statue head in the sand. Um, who was he? We don't know. What did he do? We don't know. When we read the Bible, often we're given details about what happened in the past that archaeology can help us to illustrate. So, what does it do that's valuable? Well, sometimes archaeology can give us dates. Uh, and I know my students always hate it when I start talking about dates, but every once in a while it becomes really, really important. Uh, During the last 140 years, roughly, since a fellow by the name of Petrie, William Flinders Petrie, it's been possible to establish relative dates in an archaeological dig. So when we go into a dig, when we start at the surface, we're at the modern era. And as we dig down into the mound or the tell, we're digging through a layer cake, layer after layer after layer. And the farther we go down in the layers, the farther we go back in years. And when we compare the artifacts, one layer to another layer, uh, we can establish a kind of relative date. And when we compare one tell with another, we can see the relative dates spread out over a wider area. The cabinet on the left is full of pottery. One of the most important methods of relative dating is pottery. We find pottery in all of the ancient sites. People used pottery around the house. Sometimes they used it around the palace, around a temple. The pottery was everywhere. Pottery is also fragile, so it frequently is found broken. We find pottery in the fill of a wall. We find pottery under the pavement of a road. We find pottery underneath the surface of a floor. There's all kinds of places we find fragments of pottery. And every dig produces thousands of individual pieces of pottery. Well, think about pottery as like the china, the dishes in a house. When my wife and I were married, coming up on 50 years ago, was actually 49 years this year. My wife is over here next to me, looking at me, wondering if I'll remember when we were married. It was the 29th of May of 1971, which is the Middle Bronze Age. It was a long time ago, 49 years ago. Well, 49 years ago, we were married, and among our wedding presents was some china. And this china was purchased in Japan, and it was a pattern of Noritake china. We don't have that anymore. That was one of the things that was lost in a fire a while back. As you can see, nothing lasts forever. But that pattern of Noritake china was common in 1971. It was possible to go to stores and buy that. If you were to look for that same pattern today, you would discover that it's been discontinued. The factory in Japan doesn't make that anymore. They stopped making that 45 years ago because women developed a different taste in China. The same thing is true in the ancient world. People developed a different taste. They wanted something else. They weren't happy with the pottery patterns that their grandmother used, so they made new ones. And it was easy enough for a potter to change styles. So we discovered that certain styles of pottery are common in certain years and ranges of years. Once you get used to looking at pottery, it's actually pretty easy to tell. So the archaeologist out in the field will actually look at the pottery first every day. The group goes out to the tell, we do the work all day, we dig around, we bring up any artifacts that are found, mostly pottery, put those in buckets, and the buckets are taken back to the camp. At the camp, the pottery is washed. After the pottery has been washed, it's left to dry for a day, and then the pottery is looked at. The archaeologists and graduate assistants look at every single piece of pottery. We'll call it pot reading. And as they look at the pottery, they assign relative dates. Some of the pottery they collect so that it can be reassembled into the original shape. And much of the pottery is put in the back of a truck and sent back out to the tell to be dumped in a heap out beside the tell for later years to come and look at. uh, they'll have their work cut out for them if they ever find that. So the pottery dating is the most common method of getting dates. The problem with pottery dating is that it's relative. You can tell that this kind of pottery was produced maybe 100 years after this kind of pottery, but you can't tell exactly what those dates are. To get absolute dates, we use some different techniques. We've heard of carbon 14, for example. Carbon 14 is a kind of carbon, a radioactive carbon, that is found in living things like uh, uh, people and animals. If the bones survive, there's carbon 14 in the bones. If a tree is cut down, the carbon 14 is no longer secreted in the tree and it begins declining. Because it's radioactive, it has a half-life, and we know the half-life of carbon 14, so we can guess at the length of time that the tree has been dead, or the person has been dead if we're measuring bones. Um, there are a lot of limitations on carbon 14. They're good for wood and bone fragments if we ever find them. Uh, Carbon 14 is not very good for dates beyond about 5,000 years. For that reason, carbon 14 actually can be valuable in an Old Testament site. It can be a really helpful thing. Unfortunately, getting a carbon 14 test is really expensive. Most archaeologists don't do it. One, because we rarely run into bone or wood, and two, because it's expensive and there are so many other things we'd rather have. There's some other very technical scientific things, agricultural microanalysis, dendrochronology. There's some other things that help give uh, absolute dates. The most valuable absolute dating, however, is found in artifacts, written documents that we sometimes find in the dig. So this thing on the right is the so-called Shalmaneser stele. And I can't show you the exact panel. This column is about 8 feet tall, and it's found in the British Museum. And it shows in one of its columns, it shows the king Jehu, the Old Testament king Jehu, presenting tribute to Shalmaneser. And the date is given in the years of Shalmaneser. And since we happen to have elsewhere a good chronology of the Assyrian Empire, we know that that date was 840 years before Christ, 840 BC. So that tells us that King Jehu of the northern kingdom came to power sometime prior to 840 BC, probably 841 or so, uh, because he was the king and he had to make his obeisance to the Assyrian king in 840 BC. That's an absolute date. That gives us a very hard, firm peg to hang a whole bunch of other stuff on. Sometimes we have astronomical dates, and I'll show you one of those later on as we get farther in. Now, when we speak of dates, dates are a pain in the neck. This chart will give you just the very beginning of Old Testament chronology. These are all before Christ, so BC. 500 at the bottom is 500 years before Christ, and the numbers go up, they go farther back in time. 1000, 1500, 2000, 3000 BC. I begin Old Testament history at 3000 BC because that's when written history, in the sense of um, actual language written down on clay tablets and whatnot, begins. The civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley of India all developed writing in the years around 3000 BC. Now, I believe that the flood and the creation took place before 3000 BC, but it's actually quite difficult to place precise dates on those things. After 3000 BC, we can often get fairly precise dates. Archaeologists give names to the periods. So between 3000 and 2000, we call the early Bronze Age. And it would follow then that there would be a middle Bronze Age and a late Bronze Age. So all the years from 3000 to about 1000 BC are the Bronze Age. Now, this doesn't mean that nobody made anything except bronze, of course. They also made pottery, they made things of wood. There was even iron once in a while, but iron was a bit of a luxury item. It normally fell out of the sky as a meteor, and people who found it were amazed. But we call this the Bronze Age because of the kind of cultures that we find. And it's divided into early, middle, and late because there are very, very different kinds of civilization going on in the world during these periods. For instance, the early Bronze Age is a very uniform culture all through the ancient world. Uh, it seems that there was a time of peace. Uh, we find evidence of international trade, very little war. We find evidence that people believed there was one God. It's not until about 2000 BC, actually between 2400 BC and 1800 BC, that we see the development of polytheism in the ancient world, the belief in many, many gods. It's also interesting that the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age shows the beginnings of warfare, the beginnings of great big walls, the beginnings of a much smaller population, some kind of catastrophe, I believe associated with the invention of idolatry, happens around 2000 BC. 1500 BC marks the beginning of the Egyptian Empire. For about 500 years, the great powers of the ancient world began to build empires. The Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Hittites, all were playing on this stage. The Iron Age is most of the time that we think of as biblical history. So we can put biblical history on this same scale. Abraham comes at the end of early bronze, at the beginning of middle bronze, right around 2000 BC. Moses was born about 1526 BC. And his life, which is a good long life, 120 years, spans the end of the Middle Bronze Age and the beginning of the Late Bronze Age. David began his reign in Jerusalem at about 1010 BC. And so he fits in at about 1000 BC, the beginning of the Iron Age. The Babylonian captivity ends our Old Testament history around 500 BC, actually 606 BC. But by dividing the history up into these broad eras, we can see how the Old Testament fits into secular history. It's all a part of it. Then I've got one last slide about some of our methods in the use of archaeology. This is looking down into a tell. The word tell, T-E-L, is the name we give to an archaeological mound. And the place that these kids are digging is called a square. We call it a square because it's square. What we try to do when we're digging in a square is to go straight down. So the sides of the square give us a cross section of the mound that we're digging into. And then the floor of the square gives us the plan. So plan and section are the two bits. The classic method of archaeology is a thing called exploration. And if you've ever watched the Indiana Jones movies, you know about the 19th century bold adventurer in search of treasury for the museum. Um, Indiana Jones no longer exists. The fact is he belongs in a museum too. Modern modern archaeologists are not explorers. They don't have bullwhips. They're not afraid of snakes, and they don't carry great big old 38 caliber revolvers. Modern archaeology is done by a thing called excavation. That's what these kids are doing. They use a shovel and a bucket. And if you notice carefully, the little girl in the white shirt in the upper left has got a brush in her hand. So a dustpan and a brush and a bucket are the most important tools that we use in an archaeological site. When a specific site is known to be interesting, the team comes to excavate. This will be archaeologists who are the professionals, and then a whole bunch of volunteers. It's even possible to volunteer for archaeological work in Italy, which would be kind of fun, but not necessarily biblical. An excavation is a really big deal. It can last for decades. It can cost millions of dollars. It's very careful digging of the site with a view to establishing the historical phases, what we call strata, layers of the tell. Very rarely do archaeologists uncover a whole layer. They prefer to leave something for future diggers. And once in a while, we uncover the thing to see the architecture. Sometimes just a shaft, a square will be taken straight down. And sometimes a collection of squares will be turned into a section trench. And the idea is to try to establish the chronology, the history of what's going on. And along the way, you can see the bucket in the lower right is full of pottery sherds. That's mostly what we collect. And we take that out of the tell by jeep loads at a time. Sometimes a third modern method is called survey. Survey is a technique where a group of college kids, usually with an archaeologist to guide them, will cross a large area. They'll spend a whole summer walking at, say, 100-meter intervals across the landscape, up and down and over things, trying to stay in a straight line and making notes of everything they find. So they try to find all of the antiquity sites in a whole region, like the Lower Galilee or the Central Transjordanian Plateau or something like that. They're trying to discover the pattern of occupation and where people live and what the general history might have been. They do on-site pot reading. So this is students who've studied how the pottery is read. And they'll make a note that here in this place, and they'll write down the GPS coordinates. We found several pieces of Iron Age pottery. And then they go on. That means that there's probably something there. Over the last 25 or 30 years, there have been a number of very, very important results from archaeological surveys in Israel. And then every once in a while, there's something so important comes up at a site that the archaeologists attempt to reconstruct a part of it. maybe a building or a temple or a palace or something like that. There's a place in northern Israel that dates to the time of Christ called Katzrin, which is a village from the time of Christ, complete with a synagogue, with houses, and a variety of the crafts centers. It's fascinating. The specialists have tried to reconstruct several of the structures so you can actually walk through and see what it would have been like. A fascinating project. That's very rarely done. It's mostly done for tourists, so that the tourists will be sure and come back. So I enjoy those things. So those are the major methods: exploration, excavation, survey, and once in a while, reconstruction. Now, that lays the foundation for what we'll be dealing with on Wednesday. Wednesday, we will get into the book of Genesis, and I'm not going to go much beyond the first verse of the first book of Genesis. I know everybody would like to get rolling, but frankly, there's too much there. So having laid down some of this preliminary information, we're going to dig right into the Bible starting Wednesday, 8:30 in the evening. Hope you can be there. If you can't be there on Wednesday evening, I'd love to have you look at the Facebook page when you get a chance. Okay, I'm back out of my PowerPoint, and Donna is going to come over. And we are both in red, so we're kind of, it's a different shades of red, but that's okay. And I've got to unmute everybody or I won't be able to hear a thing. So unmute everybody. There we go. Okay, now we can hear. Okay, there's Oscar.
Thank you, Dr. John.
Hey,
Thank you.
our pleasure. We love
Thank
you
you very
guys.
much.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All
Bye,
right.
Donna.
I wish we were there in person.
Yeah, we would love to be there with you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye, Dr. John.
Bye-bye.
Good night, Pastor.
Bye-bye.
Buonanotte a tutti. Ciao.
Bye bye.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.